The call came in the middle of the night. My daughter's voice was unsteady, barely holding together. She said my name once, then begged me to come get her. By the time I reached my in-laws' estate, her husband's mother was standing in the doorway, arms stiff at her sides, telling me she wasn't going anywhere. I didn't argue. I forced my way inside. They had locked my daughter in a room. When I got the door open, she was barely conscious. Whatever she was holding against her chest told me the truth before anyone spoke. I had failed to reach her in time to stop what had already been done. But standing there, I understood something else just as clearly. I wasn't too late to hold them accountable. I'm David Crawford. I'm 60 years old. For 2 decades, I've made my living confronting people who believe their wealth shields them from consequences. I call it documentary work. My daughter has always called it an obsession, and she's not wrong. It began after my wife Linda died, a medical mistake. The hospital tried to smooth it over with a settlement and a silence agreement. I walked away from their offer. Instead, I documented everything. 3 doctors lost their licenses. The hospital lost its standing. The film earned recognition, but more importantly, it forced change. That became my work, following the truth wherever it led, using a camera to expose what others wanted hidden. That night I had been doing exactly that. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was reviewing footage from an ongoing investigation when my phone lit up. Seeing my daughter's name made my chest tighten before I answered. Her voice was faint, trembling. She said she needed me. Then there was the sound of glass shattering, a man yelling, his words thick with anger. She said she had to go. She begged me again. The call cut out. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and the small camera I always kept ready. Years of this work had trained me to move even when panic tried to take over. The drive usually took 40 minutes. I got there in 25. My daughter had been married for 2 years. Her husband's family ran high-end rehabilitation facilities across New England. On the surface, everything about that family checked out. The paperwork was flawless, but experience had taught me that the most polished fronts often hid the worst truths. I had tried to warn my daughter before the wedding. She told me I was projecting my own damage onto her life, that I was trying to ruin something good. I stepped back after that, let myself believe I might be wrong. As I drove, I could hear Linda's voice the way I always did when things went bad. Her last request to me, spoken from a hospital bed, had been simple: protect her, no matter what. I pressed harder on the accelerator and pushed the thought away. I wasn't going to fail again. The estate sat on nearly 20 acres in the Berkshires. I arrived a little after 3 in the morning and keyed in the access code my daughter had shared months earlier. The gate opened immediately, smooth and silent. Too smooth. Every window in the house was lit, as if they'd been waiting. I took the front steps 2 at a time and slammed my fist against the door until my knuckles throbbed. After a moment, it opened just a few inches. Her mother-in-law stood there, silver hair perfectly arranged, her face calm in a way that felt practiced. She reminded me of the hour. I told her I knew exactly what time it was. I said my daughter had called me and I needed to see her. She replied that Emma was resting, that the night had been difficult. I told her to open the door. She said she couldn't. Then she added flatly that my daughter wasn't leaving. Something about the certainty in her voice made my stomach drop. I told her she didn't get to decide that I was her father. She said Emma was confused, overwhelmed, and that the family was taking care of it. I took a step back and drove my foot into the door just below the lock. The chain tore free with a sharp crack, and the door flew open. She stumbled backward as I came inside. I demanded to know where my daughter was. She threatened to call the police, accusing me of trespassing. I told her to go ahead. That's when I heard it, a faint sound from upstairs, a woman crying, muffled and panicked. I ran for the stairs. She tried to get in front of me, but I moved past her without slowing. Behind me, her son's voice rose in protest, but I didn't turn around. I followed the sound upward, taking the steps as fast as I could. The crying led me to the last door on the left. It was shut tight. I banged on it and called my daughter's name. When she answered, her voice was barely there. She said "Dad" like it hurt to say it. I stepped back and kicked the door. Solid wood, decorative hardware. The first blow shook the frame but didn't give. The second kick split the frame. The third sent the door crashing inward. What waited on the other side looked like a bedroom at first glance, but it felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. The furniture was expensive, carefully chosen, yet there were restraints fixed to the bed. The windows were sealed, locked from the outside. Emma was on the floor, wrapped in a thin nightgown, arms folded tight around herself as she rocked back and forth. When she looked up and saw me, something inside my chest gave way. She was thinner than I'd ever seen her, at least 20 pounds gone. Her hair hung lifeless around her face. Dark shadows ringed her eyes, but it was her arms that nearly stopped my breath. Both forearms were marked with small, exact circles lined up with intention. Some were red and raw, others had faded into pale scars. It wasn't random, it was controlled, repeated. Someone had done this to her over time. I dropped to the floor and pulled her into me. She crumpled against my chest, crying so hard she could barely breathe. She kept apologizing, told me she should have listened to me. I told her to stop. I told her I had her now. I told her we were leaving. She shook her head, said they wouldn't let her go, said they were planning to have her committed, that no one would believe her. I asked her why. The words came fast then. Her husband had been giving her pills, saying they were supplements. They made her disoriented, anxious. He kept records, videos, notes, doctor visits. Everything twisted to make her look unstable. It was systematic, careful, designed. I asked where he was. She said downstairs, drinking with his brother. That was why she'd been able to call me. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, more than one set, heavy. I helped Emma to her feet. She swayed, barely able to stand, so I kept my arm tight around her. Her husband appeared in the doorway, shirt half untucked, eyes glassy. His brother stood behind him, almost the same face except for a scar along his chin. Together, they filled the exit. He said my name like it was a joke, accused me of breaking in, of attacking his mother, said I was only making things worse for Emma. I told him to move. He refused, said Emma was ill, that they'd arranged treatment. I pointed to her arms and told him that wasn't treatment, it was abuse. He glanced down at the marks and shrugged, claimed she'd done it herself, said they'd tried to stop her, said he had proof. I knew exactly what that meant, carefully staged footage, records built to support a lie. Another man stepped in behind them, 3 bodies, 1 doorway. I was 60 years old. My joints ached. I hadn't been in a fight in years, but I'd already made one unforgivable mistake by leaving my daughter in this house. I lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, then I walked straight toward them. Her husband reached out for her. I twisted my body away just as his brother lunged. Jason's hand caught my shoulder. I drove my elbow back into his stomach without thinking. He folded forward, choking for air. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I pushed past them into the hallway and headed for the stairs. Someone was yelling behind me, his mother's voice shrill, talking about the police. I kept moving. I got Emma outside, helped her into the passenger seat, and started the car. As I pulled away, I caught one last look in the mirror. The family stood in the doorway, the house lit up behind them, watching us leave. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. At least they thought they didn't. Emma drifted in and out during the drive. I kept my hand on her shoulder and talked nonstop, anything to keep her conscious. By the time we reached the emergency department at Massachusetts General, the sky was already lightening. It was just after 5:30 a.m., quiet in that hollow early morning way. A nurse with a calm voice and gentle eyes took Emma back. I wasn't allowed to go with her. I wore a path into the floor of the waiting room for the next 2 hours. When a doctor finally came out, he looked exhausted but steady. He told me Emma was stable. He said they documented her injuries. Then he told me what worried them more, the substances they'd found in her system. I asked him what substances. He listed them carefully: a benzodiazepine, an antipsychotic, and another compound they were still working to identify. None of them appropriate, especially not together. They were running a full toxicology screen. He added that they'd notified the police as required in cases of suspected abuse. About an hour later, a detective introduced herself. Lisa Morgan. Her suit was wrinkled, her eyes sharp. She didn't waste words. She said she needed my statement. Before I started, I asked her something. I needed to know if I could trust her. I told her what the family had claimed, that the local police chief was on their side. Something passed over her face. She closed the door behind her. She said the chief and she didn't see eye to eye, said he played politics. Then she told me she'd been on the job 12 years and didn't care who the family thought they owned. She told me to start talking. So I did. I told her about the call, the locked room, the marks on Emma's arms, the drugs, the way they'd built a story to make her look unstable. She wrote everything down, asked precise questions, never interrupted. When I finished, she said it was enough to move forward: assault, unlawful confinement. She said they'd pursue warrants. Then she hesitated, choosing her words. She told me she'd already been coordinating quietly with federal investigators. The family's treatment centers took federal funding. That made fraud a federal issue. And if they were transporting people across state lines against their will, that crossed into kidnapping. Federal jurisdiction. I asked her what she needed. She said evidence, proof of a pattern, something that showed intent, something that caught them while they were doing it. She looked at me and said my daughter had already shown more courage than most people ever have. She said my daughter might have to show that kind of courage again before any of this was finished. I felt my jaw lock. I told her she'd already endured more than enough. She didn't disagree, but she said these people had been operating like this for years, that my daughter might not be the only one who needed saving. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I'd just gotten Emma back. The idea of putting her anywhere near them again turned my stomach. They were taken into custody that afternoon and released on bail less than 4 hours later. By the time the sun went down, their attorneys had already gone public, describing my daughter as unstable and me as a volatile father with a history of fixation. I was home that night, drained and wide awake, unable to sleep. Late in the evening, James Sullivan called. He'd been my business partner for 7 years. He asked about Emma. I told him she was alive, that she'd recover. Then I told him I needed his help. I needed everything on that family: financials, former staff, complaints, anything that showed this wasn't an isolated incident. He didn't hesitate. He said he'd start immediately. I spent the rest of the night and into the morning digging on my own. On paper, their operation was impressive. 5 facilities, fully licensed, accredited, bringing in around $65 million a year, but criticism had been wiped clean. Negative reviews vanished. Former employees had gone silent. Then I found the death records. 47 former patients had died over the past 5 years. The number alone stood out. What disturbed me more was the timing. Many of the deaths happened shortly after complaints were filed or after patients tried to leave early. James called just before sunrise. He'd identified 7 employees who'd left under bad circumstances. 3 had posted allegations online before taking them down. 2 had sued for wrongful termination, only to settle under non-disclosure agreements. He said he was trying to reach them. I started making calls of my own. I reached out to families of those who had died. Some refused to speak. Some broke down in tears. 3 agreed to tell me what they knew. What I heard from them chilled me. The first was a mother in Vermont. Her voice shook as I told her who I was and why I was calling. She said her son, Tyler, had spent 6 weeks at one of the family's facilities. He'd been sober for 2 years, but his therapist suggested what they described as a wellness reset, preventive care. She stopped talking for a moment, trying to steady herself. When he came home, she said, he wasn't the same. He was anxious, paranoid. The staff claimed he'd relapsed. Tyler insisted he hadn't touched anything. 3 weeks later, he was dead. They said it was an overdose, but she told me her son was terrified of needles. She said he would never have injected himself. I wrote everything down, my hand aching as I filled the page. I asked if she'd reported it, to police, to the medical examiner, to state regulators. She said she had. She said everyone gave the same conclusion. Accidental reaction to substances. Closed, that was the phrase they all seemed to use. The second call went to a man in New Hampshire. His daughter had tried to leave one of the family's facilities early after reporting mistreatment. A week later, she died during a group hiking trip. He told me she'd been hiking most of her life. When he finally saw her body, he noticed bruising that didn't match a simple fall. He raised concerns, but the sheriff dismissed them. The medical examiner labeled it an accident, and that was the end of it. The third conversation was with a woman in Connecticut. Her brother had filed a formal complaint with state regulators about conditions at one of the centers. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment. She said there was a note. The handwriting was his, but the message was. Her brother was angry, she told me. He talked about fairness, about accountability. He never spoke about shame or self-blame. Not once. 3 families, 3 deaths, 3 investigations that went nowhere. I spent the rest of the day lining everything up. Names, dates, locations, patterns. James forwarded internal files from former staff. Most of them were too afraid to speak openly, but their records said plenty: abrupt departures, complaints that vanished, legal agreements designed to keep people quiet. One name kept surfacing in the margins, scribbled in exit notes, mentioned in archived comments, referenced indirectly in deleted reviews. I couldn't quite place it, but it followed the trail everywhere. Rebecca Miller. A quick search gave me the outline. She'd been a licensed therapist, 34 years old. She worked at the Hartford facility for 3 years. She died 2 years earlier. The obituary praised her compassion and the loss felt by her family. It didn't explain why someone that young was gone. Digging further led me to a personal blog. It belonged to her sister, Linda Miller, based in Rhode Island. The site had started as a memorial. Most entries were about memories, photos, the slow process of grief. Then I found a post from about a year and a half earlier. She wrote that her sister had seen things at her last job that haunted her, that she'd wanted to speak out, that she'd been warned her career would be destroyed if she did, that the fear never left her. That fear, she believed, had taken her more than anything else. I read the entry again, and again, the name, the timing, the threats, it fit too well. I found a contact form on the blog and sent her a message. I kept my message short. I told her I was looking into the Blackwood facilities, that I believed her sister might have witnessed something serious, that I was trying to understand what had happened to her. She called me less than an hour later. She addressed me by name, her tone careful. She asked why I was digging into Rebecca's life. I told her the truth, that I thought her sister had tried to bring something dark into the open, and that it may have cost her everything, that I was trying to make sure no one else was harmed. There was a long pause. Then she asked if I could come to Newport the next day. She said she had something she'd been afraid to share, something Rebecca had left behind. I asked what it was. She said I'd need to see it in person. I planned the drive for early morning. Newport was about 2 hours from Boston, less if traffic cooperated. I left just after sunrise, gripping the steering wheel, replaying her words the entire way. I had no idea what she was going to show me, only that it mattered. Her house sat on a quiet residential street, a white colonial with dark shutters and a garden that looked deliberately cared for. She opened the door before I had a chance to knock, like she'd been waiting. She introduced herself, mid-40s, dressed simply. Her face carried the kind of grief that never really fades. I recognized it immediately. I thanked her for meeting me. She told me I was the first person in 2 years who'd asked questions about her sister. Everyone else, she said, just wanted her to let it go, to stop causing problems. She led me into a small office filled with boxes stacked along the walls. She told me they were Rebecca's belongings. She said she hadn't been able to face them before, but after my message, she'd started opening them. She took out a laptop, powered it on, and turned it toward me. She explained that Rebecca kept journals on it, protected by encryption. It had taken her hours to unlock them. When she said the password out loud, her voice broke. It had been her birthday. Rebecca never forgot. The entries were organized by date. They were precise, methodical, and deeply disturbing. Rebecca had joined the Hartford facility 3 years before her death, hopeful about helping people heal. Within weeks, she'd started noticing things that didn't add up. Patients showing symptoms that didn't fit their diagnoses. Medication logs that conflicted with treatment plans. Complaints about mistreatment that appeared, then quietly disappeared. One entry, written about 1.5 years before she died, stopped me cold. Rebecca wrote that she'd confronted a doctor about inconsistencies she'd been seeing. He warned her to stop asking questions if she cared about her future. When she pushed back, he told her she could end up like a patient in Building C who had fallen down the stairs. She noted that Building C was a single-story structure. There were no stairs. Another entry, dated a month before the end, was harder to read. She wrote that she couldn't sleep, that she kept thinking about her sister. She asked herself whether Linda would understand why she couldn't just walk away if something happened to her. She wrote that she'd made copies of everything: patient files, medication records, internal communications. She planned to take them to the state board the following week. She admitted she was afraid, but said she couldn't let it keep going. I asked Linda quietly if Rebecca ever made it to that appointment. She shook her head. Rebecca had a meeting scheduled. She died the night before. They said it was pills. Linda told me her sister couldn't tolerate alcohol. It gave her severe migraines. She barely drank at all. The examiner wasn't interested in that detail. I asked if Rebecca had ever said where she stored the copies. Linda said her apartment, but she'd cleaned it out herself afterward. There had been nothing. I paused, then asked if there was anywhere else. An office, a storage space. Her expression changed. She said Rebecca kept a small office at Boston University in the psychology building. She mentored students there from time to time. Linda said she'd never thought to check it. 2 hours later, James and I were standing in a cramped shared office on campus. The other occupant wasn't around. Linda's key still opened the door. We searched carefully. Desk drawers, cabinets, bookshelves, under chairs, nothing. Then I noticed a ceiling tile above the desk wasn't sitting right. I climbed onto the desk and shifted it aside. Above it was a cardboard box. Inside were 6 USB drives, each labeled and dated. There were also stacks of printed documents, hundreds of pages, patient intake forms with diagnoses that had been altered, medication schedules designed to suppress resistance, not treat illness, internal emails discussing patients who were difficult and needed special handling, financial records, payments to regulators, local officials, names and amounts laid out plainly, regular transfers disguised as consulting fees and donations, enough detail to follow every trail. Rebecca had kept everything. She must have known what it could cost her, and she left it anyway, for her sister, for anyone willing to look. James stared at the box and spoke under his breath. "This is it." James said it quietly, almost to himself. This was everything. I drove home as the light faded, the box locked in my trunk, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its weight. Before I even got inside, I called Linda and told her what we'd found. She broke down when I explained, said Rebecca hadn't died for nothing. As I pulled into my driveway, my phone vibrated. A photo appeared on the screen. My front door, taken from across the street. A second message followed right after. We know where you live. I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk and uploaded every file to multiple encrypted servers, separate locations, separate access points. If anything happened to me, the information would still exist. That was the only thing that mattered. More messages came in while I worked. Warnings, thinly veiled threats, mentions of my daughter. I captured everyone and sent them directly to Detective Morgan. She called just after sunrise. Her voice was tight. She told me we needed to meet immediately. Federal building, 1 hour. I found myself in a windowless conference room with Morgan and 2 federal agents. One of them introduced himself as Pierce. He didn't waste time. He said the evidence was extensive, but to move this out of local reach, they needed something specific. A crime in progress, transport across state lines, federal jurisdiction that couldn't be buried. Morgan explained their working theory. The therapist James had been contacted by Melissa Turner. They believed she was being used deliberately. Anyone who met with her would be watched, taken. The room went quiet as that settled in. I told them they were talking about using people as bait. Pierce said they were talking about documentation, tracking, timing, catching it as it happened. I told them to find another way. That was when the door opened. My daughter stepped inside. She said she'd followed me. Then she looked at the agents and told them she wanted to help. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. I said no, immediately, no discussion. She asked me to listen. She said they were still hurting people, that she wasn't willing to sit back knowing that. I told her she'd already been through more than anyone should. She told me that was exactly why she couldn't stay silent. She met my eyes and said she didn't want to live as just a victim. Pierce spoke carefully then. Surveillance teams, tracking, constant monitoring. The moment anything shifted, they would intervene. I said things go wrong in seconds. She said she understood, that this was her choice. I saw Linda in her then, the same steadiness, the same refusal to look away when something was wrong. I told her I couldn't lose her too. She told me I wouldn't. She reminded me who had taught her to stand up when it mattered. I looked at Pierce and made myself clear, if anything happened to her. He said it wouldn't. I told him I'd hold him to that. James offered to stay with her the entire time. Morgan confirmed additional teams would be in place, watching, waiting. They were supposed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, early evening. As they were getting ready to leave, every instinct in me said to stop it. My daughter hugged me at the door and told me it would be fine. She told me to call when I arrived. I said I would. Then I stood there and watched their car disappear down the street. I'd spent 20 years stepping into dangerous situations, but I'd never done this. I'd never allowed someone I loved to walk straight into it. Even knowing there were safeguards, knowing how carefully this had been planned, it felt wrong in a way I couldn't shake. The waiting was unbearable. Not long after they should have arrived, my phone vibrated. A photo filled the screen. My daughter and James sitting inside the coffee shop with Melissa, taken through the window from across the street. Clean, intentional, someone had framed it carefully. Another message followed. Did you really think we wouldn't be watching? My chest went cold. This wasn't a surprise to them. This was exactly what they'd expected, and now my daughter was exposed. I grabbed my keys and called Morgan. I told her they'd taken the bait. She said they were already moving, told me to stick to the plan, told me to bring the fabricated files we'd prepared. I got in the car, my hands unsteady on the wheel. Knowing something is coming doesn't make it easier when it does. Seeing my daughter photographed like that, watched without her knowing, brought back the same helpless fear I felt the night she first called me. I kept telling myself to stay calm. This was controlled. This was monitored. The FBI knew she was being tracked. But I'd seen plans collapse before. I'd seen what happened when timing slipped by seconds. I called Morgan again as I pulled onto the road. She confirmed they were mobilizing. Then she warned me they'd likely contact me directly. That I needed to sound panicked, agreeable, desperate, that I had to play my part. I asked where my daughter was. She told me the trackers showed movement, northbound, toward the Lennox facility. They were following, keeping distance, waiting for the moment it crossed into federal jurisdiction. She told me not to do anything that might alert them. I wanted to tell her I didn't trust any of it, that no plan was worth this, but I'd already agreed, and my daughter had made her choice. I kept driving, unsure what else I could do. Then my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I answered. The voice on the other end was loose, confident, almost celebratory. "Looking for your daughter." I asked where she was. The voice laughed softly. "Back where she belongs, with her family." I made my voice shake. I didn't have to try very hard. I asked what would happen if they hurt her. He reminded me I'd already forced my way into their house, already crossed lines, said we were past threats now. I forced myself to breathe, asked him what he wanted. He told me to bring everything I had, every file, every recording, all of it. He said to come alone to their recovery estate in Lennox that same night. If I didn't, he said, my daughter would learn what consequences really felt like. I asked to speak to her. There was a pause, a faint sound like movement near the phone. Then her voice came through, small and shaking. She told me not to come, told me not to do it. The call ended. I sat there in my car, parked in an empty lot, staring at nothing. Her voice kept replaying in my head. Even knowing this was part of the plan, even knowing she was being tracked, the fear in her voice was real. It cut straight through me. I called Morgan back, told her I'd gotten the call, told her where they wanted me. She didn't hesitate. She said it was exactly what they needed. Teams were already moving into position around the facility. The moment I gave the signal, they'd move in. She said my daughter would be out within minutes. I told her how terrified she'd sounded. She said she knew. She said my daughter wasn't alone, that they had eyes on her. I started driving north, 90 minutes through dark stretches of Massachusetts highway toward the Berkshires. The laptop bag sat on the seat beside me, filled with fabricated files convincing enough to pass a quick inspection. The real evidence was already secured with federal prosecutors. Even if they took what I carried, nothing that mattered could be destroyed. None of that changed the fact that my daughter was in their hands. I thought about my wife during that drive, her last words to me, the promise I'd made. For years, I'd believed protecting my child meant shielding her, keeping danger as far away as possible. That night, my daughter showed me something harder to accept. Sometimes protection meant trusting her judgment, trusting her strength, letting her step into danger for the right reasons, even when it terrified me. She had chosen this, not because I asked her to, because she refused to stay powerless. I was 60 years old, exhausted, afraid. Every mile closer to that place felt like I was driving straight toward my worst fear, but I wasn't walking in blind. Federal teams were already in motion. The plan was unfolding, and I still had a part to play. Just after 10, the facility came into view. Wide buildings, polished stone, money poured into appearances to hide what lived underneath. I pulled up to the gate. It opened without hesitation. They were waiting for me. I stepped out of the car, took the bag from the seat, and walked forward. My heart was pounding, but my hand stayed steady. Inside the bag were copies meant to be taken. What they didn't know was that I hadn't come alone. The grounds were already surrounded. My daughter was wired. Every word inside those walls was being recorded. I kept telling myself it would be over soon. I whispered a prayer I hadn't used in years and followed the guard inside. The upper floors were meant to impress. Soft leather seating, curated artwork, wide windows overlooking the Berkshires. Everything about it was designed to feel calm, expensive, safe. It looked nothing like what it really was. We reached an elevator tucked behind a secured door. It took us down. The air changed immediately. The basement was stark and bright, white walls under harsh fluorescent lights. The smell of industrial cleaner hung heavy, sharp enough to cover something else underneath. The guard unlocked a reinforced door and stepped aside. Inside, my daughter and James were seated in metal chairs, their wrists and ankles bound with plastic ties. They looked shaken, bruised, but alive. My daughter's eyes found mine instantly. Fear, relief, and guilt all at once. I moved toward her before stopping myself. Melissa Turner sat off to the side, not restrained, crying openly. She kept apologizing, saying they had her child. Victoria snapped at her to be quiet without even turning her head. Victoria stood near the back wall, calm and controlled, as if this were a boardroom meeting. Her son leaned against a table, drink in hand, eyes glassy. Charles and Jason positioned themselves near the exit. Victoria addressed me by name, asked if I'd brought what they asked for. I lifted the laptop bag, told her it was all there, every file. She nodded and motioned for it to be placed on the table. Her son scrolled through the contents, then glanced up and said it looked real enough. She smiled faintly. She explained what would happen next. The data would be destroyed. Then James and I would have an accident. My daughter would stay, too traumatized to be taken seriously, continuing her treatment. I told her she couldn't do that. She said they already had, many times, asked what made me think this would be any different. I told her there was one thing she hadn't accounted for. That I wasn't alone. She dismissed it immediately. Then the lights went out. A second later, emergency lighting snapped on, flooding the room in red. Before anyone could speak, Victoria's own voice echoed from speakers overhead, repeating her earlier words about keeping my daughter for treatment. Her face changed for the first time. Security feeds had been overridden. Everything was being broadcast. She demanded to know what I'd done. I told her federal investigators had taken a deep interest in her operation. The blast came without warning. The building shuddered as breaching charges went off. Shouts filled the hallway. Federal agents poured in, weapons raised, voices sharp and clear. Everyone was ordered to the ground. Victoria didn't move. Her son let his glass fall, shattering on the floor. Charles and Jason were forced down and restrained. Detective Morgan entered wearing a task force vest and read the charges without hesitation. Kidnapping, assault, fraud, conspiracy. I went to my daughter as agents cut the ties from her wrists and ankles. She collapsed into me, shaking, apologizing through tears. I told her to stop, told her she'd been brave, told her fear didn't mean failure. She said she'd been terrified. I told her that was exactly what made it courage. Agent Pierce stepped up beside us. He said none of it would have worked without her willingness to help, that without her, they might have slipped away again. She saved a lot of people tonight. My daughter looked up at me, disbelief breaking through the shock. She asked if that was really true. I told her it was. I told her she was a hero. Behind her, I watched agents escort Victoria away in cuffs. Her posture was still rigid, her expression carefully controlled, but something had shifted. For the first time, there was fear in her eyes. Letting my daughter step into danger had been the hardest choice I'd ever made, but it had been her choice too, not as someone helpless, as someone fighting back. The legal process stretched on for a year and a half. The attention never let up. Coverage was constant. A film documenting the case was released online while the trials were still underway. Millions watched in the first days. Rebecca's records, Emma's testimony, every piece of evidence laid out in full. I was in the courtroom every day. I watched people who had relied on wealth and influence slowly realize it wouldn't protect them this time. The verdicts were read on a cold Tuesday in November. Victoria Blackwood was sentenced to life without parole. The judge recited the charges one by one: conspiracy, racketeering, and direct responsibility for 12 deaths. Somewhere in the gallery, someone cried, not in grief but relief. Derek Blackwood received 30 years for assault, kidnapping, and conspiracy, tied to 3 deaths. The color drained from his face. He would be an old man before seeing daylight again. Charles Blackwood was given 20 years for conspiracy and systemic bribery. Jason Blackwood received 15 for assault and aiding and abetting. Dr. Palmer never reached trial. He was found dead at his home weeks before jury selection. The ruling said it was self-inflicted. Chief Thompson accepted a plea deal: 8 years for leaking information and obstructing investigations. Judge Harrison fought the charges until the end. He was sentenced to 12 years for corruption and obstruction of justice. All Blackwood recovery facilities were shut down, 5 locations, assets seized. An $8 million fund was created for victims. 38 survivors came forward. Every one of them received compensation. The case sparked investigations well beyond this one family. Rules tightened. Oversight increased. It didn't fix everything. It never does, but it mattered. 6 months after the trials ended, Emma started a support group with Melissa Turner. I went once. I sat quietly in the back and watched my daughter help others speak about what had been done to them. That was the moment I understood that Linda's promise had been honored. 6 months later, an envelope arrived marked as prison correspondence. Derek's name was printed in the corner. The message inside was short and meant to intimidate. He wrote that I hadn't really won, that his family still had reach and influence. He warned that when he got out, he'd come after both of us, and that next time we wouldn't see it coming. I photographed the letter front and back. I forwarded copies to federal prosecutors, the FBI, and his parole board, then filed the original away with the rest of the evidence. Threats like that don't scare me anymore. They document themselves. That same evening, Emma called. She said someone had contacted her through the support group, a woman whose sister was in a facility in Connecticut. The things she described sounded familiar, too familiar. I went to my board, cleared a space, wrote down a new name, and started digging. I'm 60 now. My knees ache. I get tired sooner than I used to. Some mornings I catch my reflection and see age more clearly than I'd like. But I also see someone who knows how this world works. Someone who spent decades learning how to expose people who hide behind money and respectability. Someone who made a promise to his wife and followed through. Emma is safe. She's strong. She's helping others survive what she did. And there are still people out there who need help. Families being pulled apart. Abuse hidden behind polished facades. So I keep going. I made Linda a promise 20 years ago, and I don't walk away from promises. What I learned came at a heavy price. The first thing is that trust isn't automatic. It's built. When people show you who they are through what they do, not what they say, take it seriously. I saw warning signs with Derek early on and talked myself out of them. I told myself I was being paranoid. I won't make that mistake again. The second thing is how easily harm can hide behind polish. The Blackwoods had money, reputation, and influence. On the surface, everything about them looked proper, but appearances don't tell the whole story. Truth exists whether it's acknowledged or not, even when it's buried under status and respectability. You have to learn to notice what doesn't quite line up. The third thing is this: you don't stop fighting for the people you love. By the time this happened, I was tired. My body hurt. Walking away would have been easier. But something kept me moving when I didn't think I had anything left. That strength didn't feel like it came from me alone. It came from refusing to let go of what I knew was right. This isn't a story I share lightly. It's a warning, and it's a record of what happens when truth is pushed far enough. These aren't made-up tales about justice. They're reminders that systems built on lies can fall when someone refuses to look away. I'm still doing the work. I still take calls from families who do nowhere else to turn. I'm still honoring the promise I made to Linda. And I've learned not to wait, not to hesitate when something feels wrong, to act before fear talks me out of it, to listen closely to that quiet certainty that tells you when a line has been crossed. Always trust what your heart tells you is.